Okay, everyone. I think maybe we'll get started in about 1 minute, 1 to 2 minutes here. Thank you. All right, everybody. I think we'll get started here. We're streaming this meeting on YouTube as well, so just to kind of respect folks' time if they're tuning in online as well. But I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening, and also acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. My name is Reed Shepard. This is my colleague Ella Gindi and my colleague Anna Giblin at the back there as well. I'm going to mute that. And so thank you everyone for coming tonight. We're here for an information session about the proposed cluster development regulations that Council has passed first reading on. So this is an opportunity to learn a little bit about the regulations and the process involved. And then if there's certain questions you might have, you're very much welcome to come up to a desk or the microphone there as well after the presentation. And we can certainly try to help you answer them. If you didn't see them when you came in, right before you came in this door, there's a set of washrooms. If you need to access those by the door when you came in. So just in terms of this evening's schedule, Ella is going to go through a brief presentation with an overview of the regulations. And then we will, as I mentioned, just offer an opportunity for anyone who'd like to come up and ask some questions about the regulations or the process or anything like that. So I think at this point, maybe I'll just pass the microphone over to Ella, and we'll get rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed, and thank you all for coming tonight. So we'll start a bit with a background. The reason for creating those regulations that are we don't have a lot of zoning as of currently in our municipality, and there's also a lack of existing development standards for this development style. So cluster developments are residential development where multiple detached or multi-unit dwellings share the same property. Since, again, subdivision bylaw standards do not currently apply to these developments, each project requires an individual review. There are some key concerns that include substandards such as roads, environmental impact, local capacity of waste and water management, and other concerns as well. And these regulations were introduced and had a first reading which expired, and then we reintroduced again for a first reading. They were passed on January 28th and are now in effect. So any development that is coming right now that is in nature considered to be a cluster development needs to abide by those regulations. So just in terms of what do MODL consider to be a cluster development? Any any development that has 6 or more dwelling units that are contained in 2 or more dwellings on a single lot. That is partially or entirely and unserviced by municipal water or sewer, but also include other different phases. So you can start with maybe building 5 units, but then when you want to introduce more units on that lot, that is deemed to be a cluster development. It's also important to understand that recreational vehicles such as RVs are not considered to be a cluster development. So here is just some graphics to give more of a sense of what a cluster development is. So you can see on the left or on your right, 2 single dwellings on a lot does not consider to be a cluster development. The one in the middle, it shows a subdivided lot that was subdivided into 4 different lots. This also does not consider to be a cluster development. What is considered to be a cluster development when you see 6 buildings on 1 lot that was not divided. Another example is you can see a multi-unit dwelling that if it's just 1, even though it's 6 units in that 1 multi-unit dwelling, it is not considered to be a cluster development. But when we had more dwellings, like so another multi-unit dwelling on that lot, it does consider to be a cluster development. Same with, as you can see, as the image further back on the right, you can have a multi-unit dwelling and then 2 single-unit dwellings on a lot. That is considered to be a cluster development. And another, when I mentioned the idea of phasing, so this is an example. You can see 2 multi-unit dwellings, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a single dwelling unit on it. That's phase 1. But when you add the 6th unit, so the other single unit dwelling, that is considered to be a cluster development. That's when a cluster development is being targeted and needs to abide by those type of regulations. Those are examples of what's going on right now as cluster developments in different areas. This is in HRM right now. Actually, I live nearby. So you can see that lot from an aerial image, and then you can see the plot land of how it's going, how those units are going to be located on that lot. That is a cluster development of 14 units. So this is how it is situated on that lot. Another example in a wider scale is this one. And this one has around 80 units on 1 lot, even though you think it's subdivided because of those, those boundaries of each area where the unit is located. It is still 1 area. It's 1 plot of land that was not subdivided, and that is another example of how a cluster development looks like. As I mentioned before, recreational vehicle parking sites are not considered a cluster development. What are the regulations that will be in a very high level? The regulations for a cluster development apply to, again, 6+ units over 2 structures on any single unserviced lot. These developments will be approved through a development agreement process. For ongoing Berlin condominium projects, a window has been provided for those developments to become legally non-conforming and becoming registered as condominium by December 31st on 2025. Council will consider individual proposal based on, again, those are probably what this is what constitutes under a development agreement. So street network, site access, emergency access is very important. Services of water and sewer, and again, availability of safe water supply, as most of our municipality is unserviced, and most of our properties and developments are will require a well, so it's an unserviced area, and the suitability of a site in relation to environmental impacts. This is a project timeline of when we started. We started initially in 2023. As I mentioned, there was a first reading done on January 28th. Today, we are having the public information session. And next week, we'll have a public hearing and might be following a second reading, depending on council's decision. If you have any questions, we would love to answer them.
Yeah, so that's just that kind of wraps up the presentation. It's very brief, but if anyone would like, I would invite those who might have some questions to come up to the podium or have a seat at the table here. Just make sure to turn on your microphone so everyone online can hear you as well. But we'll just wait a few minutes if anyone has something maybe want to think about, and but I would invite you to come up to the front if you'd like. Yeah, come on up.
I can answer that if you want it. So anything that was, any type of cluster development that was applied by development permit before having those regulations passed by council did not have to go through the cluster development regulations because those regulations were not in place. And as I mentioned before, most of our municipalities unzoned, so also there is no zoning there are no zoning restrictions for the developer or property owner to abide by, except from certain areas where we do have zoning. So where areas where we do have secondary planning strategies and zoning, those the property owner had to abide by those type of regulations. Do you want to add more?
Sure. For those developments that may be Bearland condominiums, not every cluster development is a Bearland condominium. So that's a clarification to make here as well. A lot of the developments that we're seeing here and a lot of what this is targeting and talking about are Bearland condominium. So that looks like a subdivision when people think of what a subdivision looks like, but in effect, it actually isn't real property lines. Those types of developments up until first reading has been passed here would not, if they were in an unzoned area, they would not need a development permit. They would go straight to the Register of Condominiums and go through the Condominium Act process. So there's a registration process. There are requirements that have to be met through that process. It's a lot of legal requirements. They're setting up a condominium corporation. There would be site servicing and things like that, that certain elements of the site that have to be developed, not looking at whether they meet municipal regulations, but do they meet the requirements that they've set out for themselves as a condominium corporation? So that's the process that has been underway for those developments that may be in existence today or may be underway up until first reading was passed, which creates a new process that developers have to do first before they can go through that process as well. Please. That, yeah.
Different than the condominium stream, which is part of this, but it's a different stream. Am I correct?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, in anybody, if you're in an unzoned area, even today, if it's an unzoned area and you want to build a 50-unit apartment building, as long as you can meet the building code requirements, yeah, there's nothing standing in the way from a land use planning perspective because we don't have zoning. So these new regulations are not full zoning. They are looking specifically at what a cluster development is only. That's one type of use that it's controlling. But yeah, for lots of other developments, it's just, you know, there's no zoning, so there's no permit. It's just straight to building.
The first would be
That's, yeah, absolutely. No, nothing has changed. Yeah, in terms of, and just to clarify for if there's anyone online. So the question's about like in terms of what that cutoff is and whether it's registered with the condominium or whether it's registered with Registry of Deeds or like the Land Registry Office. It's the Land Registry Office, as you said. Yep. There's been no change to the regulations as they are now versus how they were introduced previously.
That's correct. Correct. It makes the development more because of those regulations, the development will have more, it will be more safe in terms of the development itself for the people that would live in it and also the people that live near it. That's what regulations are in the end. Yeah.
While others are waiting, can you speak a little bit about the value of the planning process that we are going through and will be introducing to the public, and the zoning and land classification, and how that fits with this? Because this is kind of like, we're dealing with some issues, we put this in place, yet we have a bigger plan. And I don't know if you want to make a comment on how, if we'd had planning across the municipality, would this have alleviated some of the issues we are experiencing right now? That might be helpful for people in understanding what we're doing.
Sure. I think the best way to kind of start thinking about that question is when you look at our existing planned areas. Some of these are older planning documents that they do still need to be probably updated quite a bit, but there are zones in those plan areas. Most of those plan areas require something like a development agreement or other planning process when something, say, goes over more than 4 units or 6 units or 12 units. That's kind of similar to what this would be. When we talk about 6 units being that kind of trigger, it's similar to what is already in many of our existing planned areas. And so issues like this, or people will probably be familiar with the kind of coastal protection regulations process that that was also another big project that recently was underway here. Those types of things often do come up as a result of issues that are popping up in areas that don't have any land use planning. And so what has to happen is almost a reactive kind of approach. Is we have a really hot issue, we have something the public really cares about a lot, it needs to be dealt with immediately. But the larger question, I think, is if there's that comprehensive planning in place, you can have reasonable regulations to deal with all types of development. So other types of things that planning process will look at is creating different zones for different types of uses. So that's residential, commercial, industrial. We've seen in cases in the past, a lot of the secondary planning areas were created in many cases out of a particular development proposal. And people realized, gee, that doesn't seem compatible with my community, but we don't have any rules on that. So things like major industrial proposals, major commercial operations, real things that, when you look at what planning is about, land use conflict is often one of those things. It's a kind of fundamental piece of that. A lot of times those planning areas originated from a major conflict or proposed conflict. So what we'll have as a result of this bigger planning process is zoning on all areas of the municipality, things that deal with really problematic uses in terms of, conflicts with residential uses and things like that, put in place standards to deal with all of that. And that process is underway now, and in the coming couple of months, there will be a major public engagement kind of starting on that. So if people are wondering about kind of what is that going to look like, there's going to be several months of opportunity to see in draft form what that looks like, provide lots of input, see things on map, what's zoned, what those maps look like, and then, lots of opportunity to provide input. So please stay tuned for lots more discussion on that.
I can add to that the projects that we're working on, especially the one that will be the zoning project throughout, is also to protect our beautiful landscape and understand our beautiful communities and make sure that the land use to come in the future will not affect those. So, for example, as part of our land use project is understanding where there will be more growth centers, where should be the growth center in comparison to how should we protect our rural areas as well. So in a way, trying to create, I guess, a consistent and yet removing those type of barriers from land use. But in the end, this is a rural municipality, so we'll have zoning, but they won't be as restrictive, it's important to say, as in towns or in the city where land is limited. So we will have zoning, but the zoning will be, the zoning will be appropriate for the landscape that we have right now. Sorry, I was distracted by that sound.
I just have a couple of questions. So if you have one lot and let's say we put 6 units on the lot, so then this is a cluster development. Down the road, could we, if we wanted to subdivide one of those into a lot to sell it, is there any impact on that, I guess, as far as once it's designated a cluster development, what happens if we wanted to sell a lot?
When someone is applying to subdivide something, there's the subdivision process as well. That exists already.
Right.
So when people are doing subdividing, they're looking often at things like, does it have proper access? Can you get an access point to either a private or a public road? There's a subdivision bylaw basically that outlines those requirements that already exist now. Other things that are often looked at is, can you service it appropriately with on-site well and septic? So it would all depend on how that cluster development is designed in the start, because some people will say, well, I'm going to do a shared septic system for this property. Mm-hmm. If you go and try to subdivide something and it has a shared septic system, Department of Environment doesn't allow septic systems to cross property lines.
Right.
So that's the type of issue that,
Okay.
you could encounter, but if you're thinking about that in advance, it may not be a problem. But the subdivision bylaw, which exists now, really kind of lays out any issues like that.
Also the road standards.
Yeah, there's road standards that apply under the subdivision bylaw, that depending if you had an internal road as well.
So what is the difference, I guess, sorry, between the subdivision bylaws? So if you're doing, I guess a question from that is, if we're looking at doing a cluster development, what we see will fall under that category. What is the difference then between the subdivision bylaws? Are those, would those subdivision bylaws automatically apply to a cluster development, or it's unique to each?
No, it's unique to each, and the reason why these regulations needed to be created largely was because the subdivision bylaw doesn't cover this type of development.
Okay.
So I think what you were seeing is there's some regulations under the subdivision bylaw, such as road standards and certain site servicing requirements. If you went through this cluster development route, you didn't have to meet some of that. Mm-hmm. And so in some cases, I think it was people were tending to go towards this other development style to avoid some of the standards under the subdivision bylaw. So what this does is bring it up to a comparable kind of level in terms of the requirements involved.
Okay.
That's always been the intent, really, is to not make one seem like the easy route if that really isn't what's intended. We want to have a relatively consistent requirement for the same types of development, because I think a lot of people will see these types of developments and say, it looks the same. It looks like a bunch of homes, you know, they might share a roadway, they've got on-site servicing, but one seems to have more rigorous process, and then this other kind doesn't seem to have anything, and often people are finding out much later in the process.
Okay.
So just in terms of the public knowing about it, and making sure that things are reasonable, that's the idea, is it is relatively consistent.
Okay. And just another question, is there a minimum square footage, like per unit, like on the lot? Like, do you guys have, is there any kind of numbers around that for this kind of development?
There's not, and in some ways that can be a good thing, because what you can do in a cluster development is put the development in actually a smaller area on the site, and then do something else with the rest of the lot.
Okay.
Maybe it's just left in its natural state. Maybe there's common elements, like maybe a shared septic system, maybe other amenities for the residents.
Okay.
So because you don't have minimum lot area stuff that applies, it's more flexible in that way. You can do a lot of different things with the site because you don't have to worry about lot lines. So yeah, the short answer is no, there's not a minimum lot size, because it's always being looked at as the bigger lot. And that's where the things like setbacks and things like that would apply.
Okay. Is there anything you could think of that we might not be thinking of that would be, I guess, a negative to building, to having something like this that would be called a cluster development? Like, is there anything that we might just not be considering?
I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
it's a development style that sometimes it's trying to be the same look and feel as what you'd picture as a rural subdivision. But there are cases, and I think some of the examples that Ella showed from the city are examples of some of that's like conservation style design, or, you know, more innovative, like trying to do a little bit more compact development style that you can only do with cluster development, with this type of development. So there's opportunities using this development style that I think don't exist with subdivision.
Okay.
I think right now the primary focus really is on just making sure that the standards are brought up to something that is comparable to the subdivision.
Okay.
But there's certainly opportunities, I think, for some innovative stuff as well.
Great.
I would add, though, that with that type of development, and any kind of development, it's important to know how much water you have, and you know, and if you have enough space for a septic field, et cetera, et cetera. So those things I would take into consideration before considering having that type of development, or any development, but that specifically.
Yeah. Thank you.
Button's more obvious here. Could you just expand on that a little bit in terms of the difference between whatever environmental assessment, water and sewage we would see under without, I guess, any kind of regulations with respect to cluster developments versus what would exist in this with the new regulations?
So before having those regulations in place, you didn't have to really follow that. You didn't have to follow those steps in order to get that development done. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but now that those regulations have passed, it's important to get those steps done. Any kind of development you want to have water and septic done, especially with our municipality, which most areas are unserviced by municipality, by municipal water or municipal sewer, for example. When you have 6 units on a lot, it's important to make sure that you can sustain that type of development with those type of services. But you can jump in if you have anything else to add.
Well, I certainly understand the statement you just made. I just wondered, in terms of the new regulations, does that provide more rigor in terms of those assessments? That's where I'm coming from.
Yes, there needs to be a water study that's done. It depends on the size of how many units are being done, but I think up to 10, there is more than 10 units. We also need to do an environmental impact study, right?
I can clarify.
Yeah.
It's the water study requirement references the provincial guidelines. So the provincial environment guidelines on water assessments, there's a certain level of study that needs to be done once you reach 10 units. And then if you reach 25, it kind of goes up to that next level of rigor, I guess. So basically when looking at water specifically, that's typically one of the most impactful requirements. And I think one of the most concerning ones for residents as well. So if they're wondering, particularly in our area, we have a lot of people with dug wells, different types of geology and things like that, that in some areas that there isn't a lot of water, but in other areas there's plenty. So the water is, I think, one of the more best outcomes of this is that attention to that. And Department of Environment has specific guidelines on when a water study should be done. So this basically says we rely on that as a guiding factor. So if somebody comes in with 10 units, what we would say is, as a part of this, you need to do the level 1 hydrogeological study and bring back, satisfactory results from a professional. We would have it reviewed, and if it all lines up, that's great. And there are cases, we've talked to other municipalities where they're doing certain types of studies like that. There may be some issues that come up as part of that. So what the development looks like in the end may be a bit different. Maybe they move the units around. Maybe it's just a lower density than what they had originally proposed. But that water study component is important to that. And currently there isn't, or I should say up to now, there hasn't been any requirement for that type of study. So this is introducing a new requirement. I did want to clarify, okay, I got an email from somebody who's been watching online. They just wanted to clarify that one of the examples that Ella showed from HRM, it referenced a company that is no longer involved with the projects. They just wanted to clarify that's not their project anymore, and that there's still a Bearland condominium proposal on that site, but they didn't want to necessarily say this is our project.
It's great that they're
anymore.
watching.
So
Yeah.
yes, I'd say thank you for watching and clarifying that, but just to make folks aware of it.
Yeah, we just used it as an example and of how a cluster development could look like, not necessarily saying this is the company that does that type of work.
So I just want to clarify, for 6 units, then you need a water study done?
No, now I don't want to say with certainty that what is required and isn't required for anything. The way that the process works for any type of development, when we have something like a development agreement process in place, such as this, is what we would suggest is somebody come in, we'll set up a meeting with all of our staff. We'll get anyone who needs to be there at that time, and we can review that with people and just say, are there, there might be a situation where there's a really big issue already in that area with water. And even though you're not doing 10 units, maybe there's a lot of red flags and there needs to be a closer look at water. That's just a hypothetical,
Right.
but it's hard to tell someone exactly like these are the requirements outright. What we know is what the province's guidelines say is that at 10 units, typically you would say you need to do a level 1 study, and at 25 you need to do a level 2. But it does also say, unless there's another thing like such as a real big problem that exists already or something like that.
So just hypothetical, if there was like an issue, you came in with a 6-unit cluster development plan, we're just curious about like what is the cost of the water study and like a timeline, like how long would that take, do you think?
We don't know with certainty about water, like they're in the thousands of dollars for sure. The level 1 study is a desktop study in terms of water. So it's still hiring a professional, but they're looking at well data that exists. They're looking at geology, databases that they have access to. When you go to a level 2, the cost goes up a fair amount because there's pump testing that's involved. And so you have to actually drill wells on the site and do pump tests. What people can do when they do that is utilize those wells as drilled wells for the development itself. So it's not a completely sunk cost, but there is a bigger investment before getting the approvals in place to do that level 2. So that's when you're 25 units or more typically.
And a timeline, like let's say you do come in and there's a reason why you
Yep.
need a water study, like how long do you think that process takes to get that done?
I think it's highly, there's certain things like who they might hire in their schedules. Typically in engineering firms how do this type of work. I don't believe that the actual work takes a long time, but based on our experience, different firms have different, timelines and, well drillers and things like that. It'd be highly dependent on their availability.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect, thanks.
Hypothetically, if this passes next week and goes through, can you speak at what point the public can give input on a development coming to their community? And if you can give input on both sides to a developer who has, purchased a property, and how that would look from a public standpoint, and when they finally get the go-ahead to go through.
Yeah. So part of a development agreement is to have a public hearing. So the process is to go to an information session, as we are today, go to a public hearing, and then to second reading by council's approval. So there's the option of, first of all, for an information session, so Q&A like today, and then the following that will be a public hearing where the public can provide their input of whether they're in favor or not in favor of that development, and then it's up to council to approve that development or not.
Just to add to what Ella was saying, that kind of public session stuff to provide information about development, that would occur in the community where it's being held. So stuff that's might be proposed here in Osprey Village area, this typically would be held here. But if we're talking about something in another community, it would be at a fire hall or community hall, so that residents could come out and learn about the development as part of a development agreement as well.
I realize now I should be sitting over there, but here I am. For my own clarification, you showed one slide that had multi-unit, two multi-units that was classified as a cluster development. Can I presume that? Thank you. Can I presume that means that there's at least 3 units per each one of those? Is that correct? Okay. Thanks.
So the way I went with it is that you have 6 units in each, so you see those doors. That's how we framed it, I guess. Yeah, that's a cluster development.
So again, just to clarify that my understanding's okay, we've talked a lot about water, so that's super important, but over the last couple of years, things like single access developments that might occur in a place that's landlocked with a single road might be of a concern. The other thing might be, for example, if I understand correctly, in the absence of any of this regulation, each septic system is approved on an individual basis, and no one really looks at a cumulative effect, for example, that you might have from 25 of them in an area adjacent to a water course and so on. Individually, they get approved by the province, but no one has really had an oversight or any sort of eye on the potential effects. So if I'm correct, that was a complete absence, and this would at least allow consideration of those things during the development agreement process. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we have some physical copies back where Anna sits, if you want to have a look, and we also have that type of document on our Engage site for all of you to review if you want, the municipal planning strategy. And under section 6, so implementation, you can see the requirements under a development agreement. And one of them is, again, site access, emergency access, for example, street network advocacy, and again, water, sewer, and other requirements that you can all review if you, when you want, on either our website or where Anna sits. You'll have some physical copies.
While people are waiting for questions, can you just maybe go through, if you are getting a development agreement, can you just go through the steps that an applicant would go through to get it to approval stage? I think that might be helpful for people.
So if I understood what you're asking, the process is we get an application, planning staff will review it, we'll go to council for directions to start the approval process. The developer will have to provide some information, whether if it's, again, site access, the plot of the site plan, whether it has enough water and sewer. And then with all that, we'll go to a public information session where the public, again, as Reed mentioned, depends on the community. If it's in Riverport, so we'll go to a fire hall or a community hall in Riverport, and we'll meet with the community. We'll provide some information about the planning staff will provide information about the process, where the developer will provide information about the development itself. After that, it will go to any type of feedback that we received during the public information session. Planning staff will collect into a report, and we'll go to the Planning Advisory Committee for a discussion. The Planning Advisory Committee will review the development itself, the application, and the feedback that we received from the public. Then the Planning Advisory Committee will provide recommendations to council to consider. Council will consider them, and then we're going through a public hearing, right, Reed? Yeah, I think we're going to a public hearing before approval, but all the requirements under the development agreement process needs to be done. Planning staff will also reach out to external agencies, for example, RCMP, fire departments, EHS, etc., where we're sending them that information that we receive from the developer to let us know if they deem the development to be appropriate. So do you have enough space for emergency access? If we have a fire, can fire trucks come and turn around? Do we have enough space for that? Do we have enough space for EHS to come in terms of in case of emergency? So all those type of information we're collecting through the process, and then we're bringing it to council for final approval. So there's chances for the public to provide us with feedback on both the information session and the public hearing. And that's why the development agreement for this type of development is a good process where the community can be involved in some way.
The only thing I would add to that is just that there's formal notices, and a lot of you are probably familiar with what we call our Engage site. Every time there's a proposal that's a development agreement, a new page and a new project page is created for that, where folks can learn about the development and see stuff like, is there any upcoming meetings? Is there any documents associated with this? And then there's also formal notices that are typically posted on our website, often in the newspapers as well. Sometimes if it's a significant type of proposal or project, we'll also do things like radio ads to make sure people get the word out as well. But so there's several different steps that are intended to make sure people are notified and the opportunity to be engaged and provide feedback. Any type of development proposal that we receive, if anyone ever has written comments, they can submit those at any time, and those will always be provided for the Planning Advisory Committee and Council when they're doing any kind of decision making to see the full record of information. And then, as Ella mentioned, at that public hearing, which would be again held next week in the case of this amendment, that's an opportunity for people to officially kind of come verbally provide any comments that they'd like to in front of council at that time.
One more question. My understanding is that there might be up to 10 or so projects which are not yet built out, but have been registered and had the box ticked saying there were no regulations applied. The regulation has the so-called grandfather clause, which extends a larger period than I would have preferred. I guess the question is, if any of those projects, again, many of these projects are wonderful. Bearland condos can be wonderful projects done right and in the right place. So it's really about the right development in the right place. So if any of those, there are significant safety concerns, environmental, water, any of those things, I guess this is not going to address that because they've already essentially escaped through that net. Do you have any suggestions? Is modal planning anything in the works? Is there anything likely coming in the new zoning regulation that might capture some of those, the ability to deal with some of those concerns, or are there any other avenues that might deal with those concerns before they become a full-blown safety or environmental issue?
I guess the short answer is probably no. The opportunity to affect those particular developments would be in changing that grandfathering clause date. So as you mentioned, that it currently is December 31st of 2025 and is aimed at, as you've said, kind of underway projects to reflect the fact that they may have been already underway and already had a lot of work done, and to allow those to be completed, but there is a clock ticking on them, so they have to be finalized in terms of that land registry piece by December 31st. In terms of other land use tools that can address that, there really aren't. Like when something's considered non-conforming, it's deemed to kind of legally exist into the future. Other, those full kind of comprehensive zoning that will come into effect, in the coming kind of year and in a bit likely, that will certainly address all types of different developments, but it wouldn't necessarily have something else to do with cluster development or specific developments of that type, especially when you're looking at things that have already occurred. So all the time when we look at zoning and land use, it's always forward-looking. We can't kind of make something illegal that has already existed. So that's just a legal kind of limitation that municipalities have in terms of, saying that something can't exist anymore that has existed for a long time. And so that rule applies to residential developments. It also applies to things like commercial industrial businesses that have maybe been around for a long time. You can't introduce zoning that would say you can't exist anymore. You can say things like you can't expand, or when you do expand, you have to go through a process, but you can't outright just say you can't be there anymore. So it's fairly limited in that way.
Would there be any other things that, in one of those 10 projects that are already on the way, that could trigger an assessment? You just mentioned an expansion. Is there anything else that could trigger that kind of relook under the regulations?
That's just off the top of my head, and I guess we don't have that list in front of us, so I can't kind of give you exact numbers in terms of what developments are underway. Our development officer has that information. We can happily kind of provide more details on that. But in terms of, what happens with legally non-conforming uses, so that's things that are existing when a bylaw changes and says this, you can't do something anymore. Those are those things that can continue to exist without any restriction in their current form. So with a cluster development, as an example, whatever exists as of that date, it can be deemed to exist without any special requirements or anything. It exists legally, but anything beyond that, so if there's a two-phase development and one phase is done by the 31st of December, but there's a second phase and that second phase has 6 or more units in it, that would be under the new rules. So that's a case where, in addition to a development that may exist, creates a development agreement process for the new part that's added on.
So just to clarify, I'm still processing that one, but why is the line in the sand drawn at the level of land registry? So let's take a hypothetical bare land condo that has been registered in phases. Only phase 1 is constituted, but the roadway is put in and the other lots have been registered. That's deemed non-conforming, even though 7 more phases have not been built out or sold. Is it not reasonable to make the line in the sand that they should be subjected to reasonable scrutiny because they haven't been sold yet? They haven't been built yet? Isn't there some opportunity to at least expose them to reasonable scrutiny because there's 7 phases that haven't yet been built out?
It's a good question. The challenge, I think, is the challenge with this type of development is because there's not a similar kind of legal process to ensure that things are looked at the beginning. So it's not a perfect science by any means. It's trying to get the Condominium Act and the Municipal Government Act to agree, and they don't agree perfectly. That's certainly a challenge that we have. The reason that reasoning was basically advice from our solicitor about the best way to regulate this, and that's based, I think, on other forms of development that they've seen. You're right. There are, in its strictest form, you could, land use is typically regulated only when something's being actually built and developed. So the rules don't, something's not grandfathered normally until it's actually under construction. You have a building permit in place. But this was done with the intent because normally when you create a normal subdivided lot, that lot is looked at in terms of whether it's buildable at the time of lot creation. So we're trying to apply a similar principle to this, that you're allowing something to be created that we're deeming it to be developable, and even though it's vacant, we've looked at it in terms of can it be developed as a site, residential use, et cetera, in the future, and without changing the rules on it, midway through, we're trying to provide a kind of similar approach to subdivision. So it's worth thinking about the subdivision process and trying to apply a similar approach here. But I realize it's not a perfect, and that was a discussion that we had as well, was that these are two legal or two pieces of legislation that don't interact very well. And this was the best, I think, approach that was recommended to us, basically.
So this probably isn't an issue in the smaller, like 6-unit developments, but in larger ones, in the development agreement or the planning process, is there any consideration of how many, like, increased cars and like where cars will go? Because often new units will come with at least 1 and often 2 vehicles rurally.
Under the contents for a development agreement, you have the, under 621, A, adequacy of street network, site access, and emergency evacuation, that where it will fit in, but there's no specific subsection talking about parking, but in a way from, you can continue, yeah.
I guess at a high level, there is a requirement that this gets looked at. So it does really depend on the scale of a development, how much certain impacts are looked at. As an example, one of those commenting agencies that Ella talked about is Public Works. And so those types of developments, they see a lot of that. And they have certain thresholds that they have where if something, I think it's typically around 100 or so kind of trips, that triggers a requirement for a study. And then there's certain other, thresholds as well, but it certainly is considered. So they look at things like, even just for a regular driveway, things like, is it on a corner? Is there a proper sight lines and things just for safe entry and exit? But when you start getting into larger scale developments, they're looking at things like, traffic lights and stoplights and things like that. So it's in terms of traffic generation on the network. They look at that. In terms of like within the site, we would have the ability to look at that piece as part of our review. So oftentimes we're mostly concerned with the adequacy of like an internal road, and is it built to a standard that it's going to last, that emergency vehicles can get on. Parking for individual units, not typically an issue that we see in the rural areas, just because space is not usually like as limited. But we do want to see that demonstrated in a site plan. And certainly if there's issues that come up, we could certainly kind of address it. We'll just give it a couple more seconds here, but we may have hit all the questions, I think. And just as a reminder, people can follow up with us if there's something that they want to send in a follow-up email. Yeah.
Is there a minimum property size for, someone asked if there was a minimum house size, and the answer was no. Is there a minimum property size that could therein contain those houses?
There isn't. No.
Okay. With that, I think we will wrap things up for this evening. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come out tonight. And as a reminder, as Ella mentioned, the next step in this process is a week from tomorrow, next Tuesday at 8:30 a.m. will be a public hearing. So anyone who would like to come and speak kind of more formally in front of council with their specific comments on this. So this is an opportunity for us to give you some information. The public hearing is an opportunity for you to speak about this and share your specific comments with council. So there's an official kind of process involved there. People will be invited up to a microphone, but if you don't want to come up to a microphone, you can absolutely send that in writing. You can go send that to us. You can send it to the clerk. But if you have any questions or anything at all, our contact information is on our engagement website, and we can also give it to you tonight as well. So thank you, everyone, again for coming, and for those of tuning in online. Appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.